reality of policy is ubiquitous. At the same time, we are asked to continue to trust in the trickle-down promise in McKinsey's self-described myth-busting blueprint for addressing the global affordable housing challenge, and to believe that continuing to build as we are and have been building for the last century will eventually solve the problem. Neoliberal market fundamentalism remains very deeply entrenched in housing policies. They are rooted in the conception of housing as a commodity to be produced, managed, and traded within a market model. It underpins the dominant narrative about the housing crisis as a product of government failure, as the outcome of misguided government constraints on private real estate development. But what is housing actually? In academia, housing is something of an orphan, nested in other departments, each discipline generating valuable but siloed perspectives. Housing rarely appears in lists of subject areas in economics, except in its commodity garb within a real estate focus on land economics, mortgage markets, or demand modeling. The political economy approach to housing is recent and still emergent, but housing has both a timeless and a historical dimension. It is universally understood as home, theorized by philosophers and celebrated by poets, as shelter, as habitat, in aggregate as a spatial expression of a community, and collectively as the locus of the economy. Historically, housing as an idea and a function within civilization has evolved. The arc of the story is the shift from housing as habitat to housing as commodity. Before the Industrial Revolution, housing was integral with work and not obtained or negotiated separately. The 16th century movement in European countries to enclose the commons enabled the privatization of public land. This happened in parallel with the abolition of serfdom and other kinds of indenture that enabled the redefinition of the laborer as a free agent legally empowered to enter into private contracts. These developments created the conditions for capitalism, for the commoditization of housing and labor, and a perpetual housing crisis for the poor. Public and charity housing has provided some alleviation of misery, but never sufficient and often poor in quality. Even at the peak of Canada's social program from the 1960s to the 90s, the annual production of public housing units accommodated only half of newly formed low-income households. In the 20th century, the valorization of housing as a commodity embodying wealth that can be extracted through trading was reflected in the political prioritization of housing for ownership by an aspiring middle class, and also as a strategy for economic development. The outcome is that home ownership is the dominant form of housing tenure in OECD countries, shown in the blue in this graph. Starting in the 1970s, the character of commodification changed through neoliberal policies of deregulation and privatization. Concentration of investor ownership of residential housing accelerated. The creation of ever more legal instruments for financializing housing, along with globalization, has expanded the circle of competition for housing far beyond those seeking a home. The outcome is that the housing crisis is no longer an experience limited to the poor, but now affecting moderate incomes and exacerbating wealth inequality. The stock of non-market housing in all countries has plummeted through sell-off and declining investment. Also, when the value of housing transactions takes precedence over the value of trading in housing as shelter, there's a risk to the economy as capital investment in housing displaces investment in sectors productive of real economic value. And entanglement of regulations affecting the market housing system makes tinkering with it a risky proposition, so that crafting comprehensive reform is a truly wicked problem. But housing has other extremely important socioeconomic dimensions in its function as habitat. At the individual level, it has long been recognized as the basic prerequisite for health, and more recently as a social determinant of health, and also essential to household economic security. More broadly, housing is critical to individual well-being and self-actualization. In other words, without secure, equitable, and affordable housing, people are unable to engage in their communities or invest in their personal and career development. But housing as habitat is also a macroeconomic factor affecting the economy as a whole. The public cost of interventions for those in housing distress represents a massive direct cost, 7 billion annually in Canada alone. A lack of affordable housing is also a barrier to economic development, as employers struggle to find employees, while economic strategies that incorporate affordable housing are much more likely to achieve broad prosperity, as in Singapore. In effect, the 23 to 50% of the world population who are in housing stress today are not able to contribute fully. These socioeconomic dimensions make it clear that the state of housing as habitat has an enormous influence on the health and well-being of both individuals and the economy. Unfortunately, they have had little influence in the shaping of housing policy, dominated as it is by the market commodity narrative. But if we take a holistic perspective, integrating these many dimensions, we can assert that housing is a fundamental socioeconomic substrate, so that focusing the bulk of our policy attention on one dimension, housing as commodity, is to risk failure in important missions that embody values of environmental sustainability, social justice, and economic inclusion. Instead, reconceptualizing housing as basic economic infrastructure, as essential as water, roads, and sanitation, can lead to a practical strategy for generating sufficient non-market housing. If we consider that this housing infrastructure is a universal public good, and that we need a system that makes it universally available, then it makes sense to look to the level of government that delivers basic public infrastructure already. Here are 5 reasons why municipalities hold the key to the transformation of the housing system into an equitable one. First, they already have experience and capacity in delivering a wide range of infrastructure systems. This work requires detailed local knowledge of community needs, land supply management, technical requirements, financial administration, long-term planning, and adaptive capability. To tap into this legacy of expertise by adding housing to the mix is not a big stretch, with the provision of basic startup resources. Many cities already have public housing authorities. Second, many municipalities have successfully applied measures to expand their city's non-market housing stock. Using the power of right of first refusal, municipalities can designate sites of affordable housing at risk of loss. This is a powerful tool that could generate large quantities of non-market housing quickly. Municipalities have a wide range of land use powers, including inclusionary zoning, now widely used to require that a portion of market developments be affordable to lower incomes. However, these typically produce only a small number of still expensive homes. But some municipalities have attached more stringent conditions to require that all new units be non-market or permanently reserved for low-income tenants. Finance is the major barrier to site acquisition and development, but municipalities have developed numerous successful and often innovative funding strategies. To scale up as required, of course, new funding streams will be required. Third, they are already familiar with the land within their boundaries. They own a substantial proportion for rights of way and infrastructure. Urban land is not a naturally occurring resource, but created by cities through public investment, a social good that is privately appropriated now. Some cities acquired substantial land for housing decades ago. Others created land banks for market real estate development in the 50s through the 70s, but now are changing their mission to support the creation of non-market housing. Some cities partner with community land trusts to shelter the value of municipal land from market volatility in making it available to nonprofit housing developers. Fourth, cities are the civic nuclei of democratic nations, the crucible for civil society formations and movements for social change, and hubs for community organizations meeting needs not met by government. Municipalities are already collaborating with these community partners on difficult social and economic challenges and can build on this capacity to scale up the creation of non-market housing. Fifth, the growing ecosystem of national, international, and transnational city networks. Although municipal policies and practices are highly localized, cities share lessons, collaborate, and partner globally on multi-sectoral issues. A new city housing network focused on advancing the right to housing was formed in 2018. To conclude, reframing housing as public infrastructure enables scaling up the production of non-market housing until there is enough. This redefinition of responsibility would trigger a comprehensive process of local strategic, financial, and operational planning to build up municipal and community capacity. And it unlocks the potential of cities, the site of governance where there is the greatest experience and expertise in collaborating for innovating solutions to wicked problems. But expanding non-market housing is not a wicked problem, like the dysfunctional market housing system. It is an infrastructure problem that municipalities know how to address. And the greatest support for expanding non-market housing is in cities. The ground is prepared to welcome the new narrative. Finally, it is in cities that the housing crisis is most visible, as homeless persons, as protests, as advocacy for solutions. It is less visible at senior levels of policymaking where grand plans are formulated. Ensuring that non-market housing is always centered excuse me, in these grand plans as a public good, and that municipalities are the on-the-ground partners will go a long way to improving the likelihood that the outcomes will achieve the goals of just transition and inclusive growth.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this very fascinating and interesting presentation. And I do have a lot of questions for you in terms of how does this potentially feed into a crisis of social reproduction itself that we are facing, and I'd be very keen to engage with you. But if that's okay, we can move to the next presentation and come back and take a lot more questions, which I'm sure the audience has. But thanks a lot once again for a very interesting and engaging presentation. So on that note, may I request Karthik Manickam, who is from Jawaharlal Nehru University, who will be talking about another interesting question, Rethinking Student Loans, a Post-Keynesian approach to public higher education. So again, as we see, a lot of these issues that we're talking about are extremely related, from housing to higher education, a lot of which also feeds into the broader social reproduction and the role of the state debate. And I hope we can come back to these questions towards the end of the presentation. So Karthik, you have about 12 minutes, and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll just wait for you to mute yourself. Yeah. Just can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? My slide.
Yes.
Okay, great. And you can only see my slide, right? You can't see my notes?
No, we can't see your notes. So
okay, great. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm just timing myself. Just let me know once I'm kind of running out of time. Okay, so firstly, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm very nervous, but hopefully that doesn't carry over to my presentation. My presentation is on the need to rethink student loans as a means of funding higher education, and stems from my dissertation, which was a larger empirical and theoretical interrogation of the sustainability of student loans as a model. This presentation is largely conceptual and theoretical, and is meant to be an overview, given the nature of the audience that we have. Yeah, so I won't go into very deep specifics, but especially because of the complexity of the origin of how student loans have become the policy of choice in university expansion presently. But broadly, I identified three key factors that have helped normalize its usage. So firstly, was a paper by Friedman, which argued in favor of a form of what he called a human capital contract, where students would commit a portion of their future incomes to fund their access to university education. The next would be the conceptualization of tertiary education as a predominantly private and not a public good, partly fueled by people like Mincer and Becker, who popularized the notion of education as an investment with returns. And finally, the cost sharing framework, which argues that different stakeholders of higher education, not just governments, but also students and different private agents, should contribute to the cost of education. However, the result of that, the culmination of these ideas, has been a situation of crisis. I'm speaking in broad terms because each country has its own unique problems. For example, Chile has had its own distinct issues, which are different from India's, which are different from Korea's, which are obviously different from what we typically talk about in terms of the global north, so the US and the UK. But there are still very strong commonalities, and I consider them all to be part and parcel of the same broad issue. Firstly, being an increase in the average cost of tuition and an increase in the size of student debt, particularly since the 2000s, since the post-millennium period. Secondly, access to higher education in relative and absolute terms remains highly unequal, particularly for marginalized groups, and particularly once you control for income across groups. And thirdly, an increase in vulnerability of universities to financial crises due to greater reliance on tuition funds as opposed to public or other sources of funds. So this was particularly evident, for example, during the COVID crisis, where many universities saw their futures jeopardized as a result of a loss of international students or other forms of like students not being available on campus to provide funds and so on, and then the vulnerability that resulted from that. So unfortunately, it's not just the crisis, but also the failure of mainstream responses to address these crises, which is why we need to rethink how we think of student loans. So firstly, with respect to the issue of rising tuition costs, they're often dismissed on two accounts. Firstly, that debt is in fact manageable, and that the larger debt can be offset by an increased earnings potential. So Akers and Chingos, for example, they did a study in the US, and they argued that most of the issue stems from people who do not complete their degree, for example, and then remained without a degree as well as without student loans. As well as with a large amount of student loans. But for people who do finish the degree, they earn more money, and thus the debt is manageable. And secondly, the argument is that you can mitigate some of the impact of traditional mortgage style loans, which is what the US has, where you have a fixed term of repayment, and you're sort of, if you lose income 1 year, then you're vulnerable to the fact that you have an outsized loan payment relative to your income that year, with something called income contingent loans. Which is what's used, for example, in the United Kingdom and in Australia, where you mitigate the cost by paying a portion of your income per month. And so only the duration of your loan increases or decreases based on your income. However, these are not adequate responses. So firstly, the data issue, there's a major data issue in some of the analysis. For example, Akers and Chingo rely largely on pre-2008 and 2000 data. So they fail to capture the degree of inequality that has happened post-millennium and post-2008. And secondly, there's a failure of comparison across time. So for example, yes, your tertiary education makes you more competitive to your current peers who don't have a tertiary education, but how does your income potential compare to previous generation of college goers? So there's an ahistoricity in things like Mincer equations, which don't get addressed. And thirdly, because there's a fundamental ignorance or possibly an unwillingness to engage with the reality of the impact of wage stagnation and high graduate employment. So the fact that wage stagnation is no longer just an issue for jobs which don't require a tertiary degree, but also among certain classes of careers which require a tertiary degree. For example, some forms of some cities in the US whose lawyers have had wage stagnation in the recent past. This becomes a major issue as well. So these responses don't address those kinds of questions. Next is the question of inequality of access. A lot of the focus has been just on addressing information asymmetry. So just tell people from marginalized communities about available services or about ways to access loans. So is that, for example, like creating a new website which integrates all student loan options, something like that. And the other option is to improve aid targeting. So try and focus how you target aid for people who need it. So we all know the issues, and we've all discussed, a lot of discussions have happened in the past as well about the issues of aid targeting. But the other thing is also obviously that these fail to actually address the structural barriers which prevent access. So even if you have the information, if there's a structural barrier that prevents you from accessing these loans in the first place, which is, for example, a major issue in India with respect to the issue of caste, then the problem of inequality of access doesn't get resolved through mainstream approaches. And then finally, the issue of the narrowing of revenue streams. So firstly, this is often argued is not a problem at all, but actually a feature, because the idea is that universities would have to then compete for student tuition in order to gain more students, and then so they would necessarily improve services. So because you're treating the university as a service provider, if they have to compete with other universities, they'll improve their services. And the second response is that this would force universities to diversify their revenue streams. So instead of relying on students, they may need to monetize their assets through endowments, through sale of services to the public, and through other forms. So this is an issue on multiple fronts. Firstly, universities are not interchangeable. One university is not equivalent to the other, both nationally and internationally. So universities are not competing on tuition alone, and thus that becomes only one factor and possibly a much less priority of a factor than other ones. Secondly, not all universities have the capacity to monetize. So for example, a rural university that targets agricultural students may not necessarily have the capacity to monetize their resources as compared to, say, a private medical college in the heart of the city. This necessarily creates demand and financing mismatches. And that precludes price-based competition. And finally, that also intensifies the financial disparity between colleges, which makes existing inequality amongst colleges more and more entrenched, which makes it difficult for lower ranked, I don't like the usage of the word ranked and lower ranked, but which makes, let's say, newer universities or universities that are qualitatively quite excellent, but may not necessarily have the footprint of larger, more well-known universities, it makes it difficult for them to compete as a result. So the outcome, essentially what I'm trying to say is that by focusing on mitigation and justification, the status quo is maintained, and mainstream responses fail to accurately diagnose and address this present crisis. However, equally, we as academics, activists, and public citizens would be failing if we sought to address these issues only while being rooted in the same base assumptions. It's not enough to critique these issues, it's also necessary to build an alternative framework of analysis. So what I've done for this purpose is to draw from post-Keynesian literature to find a new way of engaging with how universities should be funded and how to conceptualize the idea of a university in the public financial system. So because post-Keynesian theory is quite vast, and paradoxically higher education within post-Keynesian theory has been relatively under-discussed, I would argue, I've had to cast my net wide. So firstly, one element that I draw from is Galbraith, who in The Affluent Society challenges the investment good conceptualization of education and argues that there's a need to focus on the consumption component of education. So education as a good in and of itself meant to create better citizens. I would argue that a more radical interpretation of this could be the decommodification of education itself. He also draws attention to the reality that other agents, which I argue would be the equivalent of the cost sharing approach, don't actually have the capacity to create the levels of investment required to sustain higher education. So for example, no employer will want to fund a student's education knowing that they will eventually leave for another job. So the degree to which you can create individual instances of, let's say, like a large private institute, like a large private company funding someone's education, you can't extrapolate that to a system, which would be to cater to education for all. The next element of analysis comes from Steve Pressman, who actually developed a framework of analysis for primary and secondary education, in which he discusses the need to consider historical factors rather than equilibrium. So people don't just choose their schools because of cost, but because of historical and other parameters, and it's necessary to account for that. Similarly, Pressman discusses the idea of the Keynesian beauty contest in the context of school choice. The idea that people are choosing not the best quality place for them, but the most popular based on media and based on other sources. This can also easily be understood in the context of universities, where prestige factors, as I mentioned earlier, factor not just into student choice, but also alumni endowments and donation choice as well. And then finally, the issue of risk versus uncertainty, risk being calculable using probabilities and uncertainty being incalculable. So uncertainty creates different conditions of investment where future projections are unreliable. Higher education in that context has to be considered as a source of uncertainty and not risk. You cannot predict what the job market would be for your degree 5, 10, even 2 years away from now. And when you factor in existential questions such as automation, climate change, even the COVID pandemic and stuff, it basically renders any attempt to model tuition-related fiscal risk very questionable, which means that you cannot then base your system on student loans, which necessarily requires you to model risk. So what does that mean for how to conceptualize a post-Keynesian framework? Firstly, investment-related decision-making that has to be delinked from risk optimization and the inducement of competition. So delink the two ideas. Reject the conceptualization of higher education as a form of human capital, so decommodification. Recognizing the heterogeneous and non-financial determinants that influence enrollment, so recognizing historicity. And finally, refocusing tertiary development towards public need versus a supposed market demand. So this is where the ideas that have been extensively discussed on non-market and public purpose become fundamental. So where I see future areas of exploration include, one thing that I intend to do or hope to explore is developing a stock flow consistent model of the higher education sector, either at the national or the international level, in order to better explain the inherent financial instability, because I think that's an area that needs highly under-discussed. And secondly, to situate the university's role in knowledge economy through a reconceptualization of the idea of public purpose. I think this is a very relevant area of analysis because tertiary education often gets under-discussed, particularly at the global level in comparison to primary and secondary education, despite being more and more relevant as more and more people enter the tertiary sector and find themselves unable to secure employment or achieve the goals that they were promised prior to joining these spaces. Thank you. That's the end of my speech. I look forward to questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Karthik. I think a very interesting presentation, and particularly where IIPP is based in the UK as well. It's something that's kind of become, there have been a lot of protest movements that have been happening within the university spaces. And a lot of these issues kind of just the neoliberal turn has been brought in. And it's interesting to see that, with the rising and the mounting debt, both in US and UK, which have undertaken this sort of privatization, we are now in a scenario where in the developing countries, India included, there's actually now this movement towards privatization in the last 10 to 15 years, which has really picked up. So we already have a global case of how it has not worked out. And now we're trying to reinvent the wheel and basically taking up these similar issues which have to a large extent failed in the global north as well. So very relevant and very timely. We'll come back to more questions and discussion on your presentation. But for now, we'll move on to the next one. And I'm sure there's a lot more interest and engagement from other participants as well on the issue. Thanks a lot. So we're now on to our last presentation by Vinh Mai, who is from UCL, and who will be presenting on redefining state-owned enterprises as a public investment manager and transport delivery model in developing countries, a business history analysis of Vietnam's highway development during 2004-15. So over to you, Vinh Mai.
Are we good? So you guys see my
Yeah.
okay. Let's see. All right. So today will present a part of my sort of PhD research on redefining SOEs as a transport delivery model using a business history approach when I looked at the history of Vietnamese highway development. For the background, I'm a PhD candidate at the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction, where we actually focus on probably a project level, where we build projects. So I think this is one of the most important slides of today's presentation, where I will focus on the key concepts, because as you know, a bulk of what government does is actually deliver public infrastructure projects. So these concepts relate to a bit of project and program language, where how we actually see this concept. So the first difference I want to make is the difference between greenfield and brownfield projects or programs. So greenfield projects, refer to a new build of an entirely new highways, hospitals, and schools. Whereas when you look at the brownfield projects, it's just basically an improvement to the existing already existing facilities. So for example, when you listen to President Biden saying, the US is going to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure, just basically those are brownfield projects, which, the impact in terms of economics, job creation, social mobility are not that strong relative to greenfield projects. So why is it important? Because public budget in developing countries is spent mostly on greenfield projects, whereas obviously in developed countries, a lot of these come to go into brownfield projects. And not only these greenfield projects are riskier and more uncertain, but there's also a question of technical capability, especially facing governments in developing countries, how they build these things. So it might be easy for a greenfield project or brownfield project in developed country where there's a a strong domestic capability on how to deliver them. But in developing countries, that's not the case. The second difference that I want to emphasize, and obviously for the past 4 days of the conference, a lot of speakers have, directly or indirectly emphasized the difference between the term financing and funding. I think this is, from a project perspective, this is one of the most important difference that, practitioners, policymakers, so on and so forth need to understand. So when we talk about financing of infrastructure, we really mean upfront capital, answering the question how you mobilize upfront money to, to basically construct the infrastructure. Whereas when you talk about funding, it's really about a long-term payment, how we actually pay for that financing. So, financing is mostly, comes in form of equity and debt, whereas funding is really, at the end of the day, it's all about, people, the general public that pay for it, either directly or indirectly. So why is it important? Because, obviously in developed countries, they only face a funding problem. The notion of there too much capital chasing too few projects probably, only makes sense in developed countries where, they obviously there are a lot of financing. Whereas in developing countries, they are both facing financing and funding problems. Financing is because, there's not much sort of long-term capital to sort of finance these, risky, uncertain greenfield projects. And funding problem means that, there's lack of demand or, user pay for these kind of infrastructure. And the third concept that I want to emphasize is the sort of, what it means for delivery modality of public infrastructure and services. It actually refers to, the life cycle provision of public infrastructure assets. And OECD, I think in 2015, they have a report. They have they lay out, definition of each of these delivery models. And I want to make sure that we all understand what they mean. So as you see, as we move down here, it's actually the government actually outsource more toward the private sector. And for the sake of my research, I actually focus on, traditional public procurement, which basically means that the government use public finance, to procure civil works, and then they will, have a different agency. Once the asset is constructed, the operation and maintenance of the facility is transferred to a different agency, which, in the sort of PPP literature, they call it a broken agency problem. And then state-owned enterprises, what I mean is the actual, a firm that actually owned by the state, whether or not the majority of by the state. And obviously we all understand, public-private partnership is a contractual arrangement. And why I want to emphasize, the three distinct model is because when you actually look at the literature of PPP, a lot of these, especially in developing countries, a lot of these sort of proponent of PPP misunderstood, and they mix a definition with the SOEs. For example, you will see that a lot of research on Chinese PPP, but it's actually these are SOEs companies. It's not, it has nothing to do. It's not a PPP in a sort of Western definition. So why it's important? Also because, as contracting become more complex, because we are the government outsource more, it comes down to, the contracting capacity and capability of the government, and it obviously present a new set of challenges. And obviously it will, become more serious in developing countries where, there's a lack of rule of law and so on to enforce contracts. Oops. Okay, and so research motivation, the whole anti-PSSP narrative and the role of IFI, in exporting privatization and marketization. And, really, they basically, the global north trying to, with the help of IFIs, trying to export the sort of PPP model to developing countries. But however, there's still continued importance and relevance, of SOEs in the 21st century. And now we for the past decade, we actually see a renewed research agenda on SOEs, particularly on the role of SOEs as a provider of public infrastructure. So with that motivation, my PhD research used a business history perspective to investigate the sort of role, functions, and performance of a particular SOE in Vietnam as an alternative delivery model for highways. And when I look at the literature, most of the literature on network infrastructure focus on the performance of these SOEs. However, as you already know, especially in the context of developing countries, a lot of these, include the, the public proposition, which makes, the company is not meant to be profitable. So there's a mixed findings there. And most of the literature on infrastructure SOEs focus on utility, telecom, and rail sector rather than highways. And when I look at the road infrastructure delivery and highway privatization literature, they mostly dominated by PPP literature, in which SOEs were treated as either part of traditional finance or PPP. Like I mentioned, one of the prime example of these mistreatment is the fact that, the Chinese PPPs but in fact, these are delivered under SOEs model. And interestingly, when I look at the history of Vietnamese highway development, it has three distinct sort of delivery models. Each of which has a distinct characteristic. There's a different lead organization, client organization, different financing structure, funding, the right to toll, for TPP, traditional public procurement is financed by tax revenue. So, there's no right to toll, whereas in Vietnam, the SOE has the right to toll, and the same with BOT companies. And in terms of project stages, which actually one of the biggest key driver of efficiency in the comparison between PPP and traditional public procurement is the broken agency. And in Vietnam, the SOE actually also oversee both the build and the operation of highways. And here's the sort of phenomenon. And the Vietnamese highway development consists of sort of what I call three phases of development as of now. So phase one is starting from 2004 to 2015, and you can see on the chart here the SOEs actually account for over half of the operation network in phase one, which is 2016. And that's sort of the my whole sort of research project focus on the three phases, the sort of the rise and fall of that SOE model. And this is the, okay, so some of the key milestone here. In 2004, the government established this company to finance and build the very first highway project in Vietnam, using actually project bonds guaranteed by the government. And then in 2007, the government began to approve pilot financing and funding for this company to leverage ODA financing, non-concessional financing from IFI. So they have been working very closely with IFI to finance and build highway projects. And this is the timeline. I'm not sure if I run out of time. Yeah, it's running out of time. So the research question is, why did the Vietnamese government establish this VEC, and as opposed to traditional public procurement and PPP during the first phase of development? And in terms of the analytical framework, it draws upon and combines multidisciplinary insights from transaction cost economics and resource-based theory. And a choice of a delivery model for highway project can be viewed as a choice of governance mode for that project. And in this case, the Ministry of Transport, as a project sponsor and decision maker of which mode to be selected, can choose either to internalize, meaning that deliver a highway project using a traditional public procurement route or this SOE, or they can actually outsource it via PPP model. And here's this sort of an evolving analytical framework that I've been working on. So basically what it means that the governance structure means there are three delivery models in which they have to get input from the resource, where you have to answer whether these delivery model can generate resource in terms of financial, in terms of technical, because it's not just about the financing question, but it's also about the capability question. And transaction here, meaning that when the government choose a delivery model, it's about how they arrange that transaction to happen, either via TPP or VEC or PPP model. And I use a case study research method and collect data from both documents and interviews. And preliminary findings, the government pursue, in the first phase of highway development in Vietnam, the government pursued multiple objectives. Number one, it wanted to develop some highway segments. At the same time, it wanted to reduce the need for relying on state budget for financing and funding the segments. But at the same time, they also want to leverage external financing resources, mostly from the IFIs. And major constraints facing the government included, lack of enabling regulatory and institutional framework for all of these delivery models, because these never existed before. The Vietnamese government back then didn't know how to build highways. And the second constraint is the lack of domestic financing and funding. Going back to the very early slide where I said that, in developing countries, they face both the financing and funding problem, not just the funding problem alone, just like the global north. And there's a lack of technical capability in both the government and domestic private sector. Again, tied back to my early slide, this is all greenfield projects. So obviously there's no capability in these developing countries to deliver these projects. In contrast to a lot of PPP literature, talking about, life cycle efficiency and whatnot, in these developing countries, financing availability was the only key driver of the delivery model. And like I said, life cycle efficiency is often emphasized by anti-PSSP narrative, was never considered. And this SOE VEC was established as a policy instrument of the Ministry of Transport to meet these policy objectives while addressing challenges facing the early development of highway. Relative compared to a traditional public procurement, the SOE model could actually levy toll on road user, which is address the funding problem, while they can actually mobilize financing resources from the capital market and also the IFIs. So again, addressing the financing problem. Compared to PPP, the SOE model could access to public funding, and it's actually because it has the first mover advantage. So, PPP is actually structured in a project finance kind of arrangement. But with this sort of SOE model, they can pull funding, toll revenue from different projects that they manage to sort of subsidize, to create a cross-subsidization effect. And with my sort of preliminary finding, it also find that there's no evidence of cost discipline and emphasis on operational efficiency with the SOE model, because there's a certain level of risk transfer from the government to that SOEs. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Can you mute yourself so that there's no echo?
How can I stop sharing? Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Vinh Mai, for the presentation. And we will be now moving on to the discussion. I would like to open the floor Please feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hands so that I can call upon you for questions. People who are participating as well as fellow panelists can ask questions, so do feel free. Yes, Karthik, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much. I had a question for Giorgio. I really appreciated the presentation that you had on the relevance, or like on the whole notion of e-governance and everything that you mentioned. One question that I had was with respect to what you mentioned about a single ID.
Can you please raise your voice?
Yeah. sorry. Yeah, the question was about the single ID that you mentioned, the single unified ID. Do you have any concerns about the vulnerability that this introduces for tracking, for example, by a motivated government, or a system in which a regulatory capture occurs of, say, the people who are running this unified single ID process of a digital thing? Yeah, do you have any like suggestions or like ways to respond to an issue along those lines?
Thanks. Just once, can we take a few questions and then we can just go? Thanks a lot. Mutaka?
Okay, thank you very much, the moderator. My question goes to Vinha. Thanks for an interesting presentation. I'm curious to find out, based on the influence of the international financial institutions in driving those policy narratives of marketization in the countries like Vietnam you have cited, I would like to ask, did you find out if there is any influence of the policy, like policy advice, especially the Article 4 reviews of the IMF in conditioning those policies, or the World Bank development policy financing, especially their prior actions before they give loans? Did you find out in the course of this research any influence of those lending policies or policy conditions in terms of conditioning this kind of marketization and privatization? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mutaka. Hector?
Yes. Thank you so much. My question is for Karthik. I really enjoy your presentation. Well, I'm working also in higher education funding policy. My question is, if you think that the proposal for debt cancellation that have been discussed in the US, but also in Chile and Australia lately, can be considered part of a new strategy for public funding, or as you call it, like the post-Keynesian approach to higher education. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hector. Mansoor? I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, and if you can hear me, could you just unmute yourself and ask the question, Mansoor?
Oui, merci à tout le monde pour les interventions si précieuses et de valeur. Est-ce qu'on peut avoir ces interventions ou même des résumés en arabe, en français et en anglais? Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I wonder if people caught that, because you can use the live transcript option and use it in order to translate, if people didn't catch that. I might request you, Mansoor, to basically repeat the question in case the participants didn't capture it. Could you repeat your question? I think they are still turning on the live transcript. So as you say that, they can probably use the translation tool.
Je répète ma question.
Can you repeat the question?
Oui, merci beaucoup pour toutes les interventions. Je les suis avec beaucoup d'attention. Ils sont de valeur et ils peuvent aider beaucoup les syndicalistes. Mais je voudrais bien, est-ce qu'on peut avoir des résumés de toutes les interventions de cette journée en français ou en anglais ou en arabe? Voilà ma question. Peut-on avoir des résumés dans les trois langues?
Okay, thank you. So I'm not sure how good it sorry.
If I understood well, he wants to translate a resume in French.
Okay, so I do know that there are translation tools available, and I will just put in the information on the chat. So we'll just get back to you on that. Thank you. And any other questions at the moment? So if I may just add a question to the mix, and then we can go to the panelists to respond. My question is for Elizabeth for the presentation. I wondered, like, to what extent do you think this entire framework of housing, and I really like the way you're talking about this, not just as a commodity and that being one dimension, how does it feed into the entire discussion of the social reproduction crisis that we are facing at the moment, where again, these conversations about what is commodity and to, basically the things that might need to be provided through non-market access to just provide a stability to the economic system. So that's one part of the question. And the second part is, and I hate to be the person to ask this question, but how do we think about the viability of this proposal? I agree with, I see the point of basically municipal corporations playing a huge role in this. But with the huge dominance of real estate and finance capital that have huge gains to make from this sort of privatization of housing, how can we envisage a possibility? Because a lot of examples that you gave have been relatively more historical. So I wonder if in today's kind of economic climate, there is a possibility of something like that. So any other questions, please do feel free to put in the chat. We'll take a round of responses. We'll go to the break and then we'll come back where we'll continue this conversation and also some broader reflections on moving forward. So we'll go in the same order as we So may I first request Giorgio to respond to the question that was posed to him?
Yeah, thank you. Of course, I mean, there is no actual risk in the using of just one electronic ID, because from the government point of view, it's there is no difference if you use public services with an electronic ID or with a physical ID. They have the same amount of data. No such difference. The only difference is that you do not have to waste time and use car to reach and to head the public office. So essentially, there is just this difference.
Okay, Karthik, I wonder if you have some response, but maybe we can come back to it in the next round. Thank you. Elizabeth, over to you.
So thank you for your question. So first of all, your question about social reproduction challenges is a big one. So let me answer it a little, telegraphing a little towards your second question as well with a specific example. So the challenges are enormous, and the competition for what do we do first or where do we put our resources is a big one. As far as the prioritizing housing, that's really, I think, the message that I'm putting forward. And I think what I didn't speak to in the presentation, although there's a reference in the slide, is that the evidence is so clear now that if people do not have secure housing, everything else falls to the wayside. And a story I'd like to share with you on that is how successful a city that you would not expect, Houston, Texas, has been in reducing its chronic homeless problem. So where other cities are, homelessness continues to rise, Houston has managed to reduce its chronic homelessness 63% since 2010. So, little past decade. And their goal is to end chronic homelessness by 2030. They've managed to move 25,000 people into permanent housing, which and they're tracking this. So after 2 years, the people that move into housing, stable housing, supportive housing, remain housed. And these people are then able to rebuild their lives, to pursue education, to become employment, to deal with their mental health challenges, with their addiction challenges. And that's been possible because of the goal that was set, the collaborations. It was what I was speaking to towards the end of my presentation, bringing together the private sector, the public sector, finding the funding to generate this new housing for this population. So, but the point is that that if we don't address the housing piece, it doesn't matter what else we do. You know, there used to be, and you know, the strategy for addressing homelessness there used to be a conditionality around it. Well, once you deal with your addiction challenge or your mental health challenge, once you get a job, then we'll help you with your housing. And there has been, in the past 20 years, there's been research that shows that we need to turn that around. First, we provide the housing, no questions, no conditions, and provide that stability, provide the wraparound supports, and then everything else becomes possible. So I'm not sure if that's speaking to your first question, and I'd be happy to build on that if you have a follow-up. But to your second question regarding how utopian this may sound, I think that's really what you were saying. I mean, a great idea, but actually, how do we do that? Well, the reality is that many cities are doing this. Many cities are activists. We have that network that I mentioned to you, I mentioned in the slide, the Cities for Adequate Housing, was set up by Leilani Farha, who was the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing. And she has convened, she's built a movement among cities who want to advance the right to housing in their cities. And this is what I think, when all of this high level policy discussions happen, we lose sight of the fact that we have this incredible capacity at the ground level where movements build, where people collaborate, where there are these face-to-face relationships, people know each other. I mean, cities are crucibles for transformation. And so how this is possible is not with a global top-down, you know, heaven forbid, getting McKinsey get involved, you know, with a plan. You know, it's bottom up. It's looking to the cities where the culture already exists, where the capacity exists. And Houston is a great example. Barcelona is an example. Vancouver is an example. This is where you already have collaborations with community organizations in the cities who already want to do this and are already doing it. So it happens from the ground up, and it happens by starting in those cities and supporting those cities that are already doing that, like San Francisco, that has exercised its right of first refusal on properties at risk, not to purchase those properties itself, but to give that right of first refusal to a qualified list of nonprofits. They're pre-qualified, so they can immediately put a hold on any sites that are at risk of being lost. These are in Montreal. No, the province gave Montreal that right to designate sites that it's going to protect. So this immediately allows the city to intervene when real estate investment trusts or private equity funds, you know, Blackstone comes in and wants to buy a swath of properties. Montreal gets first right to purchase those properties on behalf of itself or on behalf of nonprofits. So this is how we do it, is by looking where already there is movement, already the ground is prepared, and supporting those. And this is where my own interest is in building on this.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for those responses. Thanks a lot. Yeah, if we do have time, I would want to engage more, but let's go to the next presenter for now. Karthik, there was a question posed to you as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Hector, for that question. I would say with respect to debt cancellation, it entirely depends on the circumstances. If debt cancellation is the final step or presented as the solution entirely to the question of the current crisis, then I would say that no, it's not a part of a new strategy. It's simply a tool to sort of quell the protests that are coming up and sort of like let the fires die down a little bit. If debt cancellation is the first step in a larger movement to restructure how universities are funded, then that would definitely be a part of a new strategy for public funding. So for example, in Chile, I think when 2016, when the earlier protests happened, debt cancellation was the first step, followed by an attempt, at least, which was eventually reversed, to restructure how the universities were funded. In that case, then I would consider that to be part of a new strategy. But it's essentially that. So one of the issues with the current debate in the US is exactly that it is presented as the solution and not just the first step in a much broader, much more targeted solution.
Thanks.
وثم القديم يقول لي خليلها.
Is he asking a question? I am not sure.
اي نابل تونس سوسله. ربي معك. هيك هو والله كبست علينا الدنيا. انا عندي ميكانسيان قال لي قل له هشد كرهبتك.
Okay, I think we'll first go to the last presenter and for him to respond and then come back to any other questions that might be there. Vinh Mai, do you want to respond to any question that was posed to you?
Yeah, sure.
Do you want to unmute yourself?
Let me. All right. So thank you for the question. I mean, there's a long and short version of that for the answer, but I'll speak sort of from a researcher perspective in the subject, but also, for the past few years, I've been working as the sort of local consultant for the World Bank in Vietnam. So I actually know how they work. In terms of conditionality, it's actually more complex than that. So when I looked at the SOE model, it's actually motivated by IFIs, because if you actually look at how IFIs do their financing, it's actually different sort of financing products. So there's a concessional loans, there's non-concessional loans, meaning basically the interest rate are variable, and the sort of the terms of payment and less sort of concessional. And so when you look at that, one of the conditionality that I see is actually which I think harmful for developing countries is the international competitive bidding framework. It's because, like I said, when the domestic contractors, they don't have the capability to deliver highway projects or any other sort of mega projects. So when the IFIs come in, they actually require these international competitive bidding framework, which actually benefit these foreign contractors, construction contractors, who then just basically bring their management team to the developing countries and sort of outsource these construction contracts to local contractors. So basically, they just cut it smaller. So I think that's sort of the sort of indirect conditionality, if you will, that I see. And also, there's one thing that I also want to emphasize is the fact that one of the sort of angle that IFIs approach in financing projects in developing country is the fact that they finance pre-FS, a pre-feasibility study and feasibility study, which actually has the design component into it. So for example, if the money comes from Japan, then the consultant for the feasibility study will be Japanese firm, and then they will sort of create some specifications which is really attractive and create some sort of competitive advantage for Japanese contractors in the later stage of the project. The same thing with the Chinese, the same thing with the Korean. Yeah, so that's sort of a long sort of version of the answer.
Thanks, Vinh Mai. I think we've already basically exceeded the time that was allotted to the session. We will be having more conversations both about this session as well as about general open discussion on looking forward. If you are able to stay back for the next session after a short break, that would be great. If in case not, I wonder if it's okay for the presenters for people to follow up with you. In case it is, could you just input your email in the chat so that all of those who are interested to engage can follow up with you. And if you're able to stay back for the next session where we could have more open conversation, that would be great as well. So let's go into a 10 minutes break, and the Zoom room will remain open, and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes for the next segment, which will be an open discussion. And that we will probably have to go over time for that as well. So we may begin at 5:10 and end a little before 6 p.m. UK time. Thank you.